Good evening, good morning. Here it's morning. I guess at your place it's evening. We live for the moment in a very strange period, which I call post-synchro time, because the question is, did the year 2020 really exist? And what I'm presenting here is an image of how we exist right now in Paris at the Grand Palais, of which I'm the president. I'm the president of the Grand Palais and the Réunion des musées nationaux, which is the Association of French Museums. And of course, just like you, we are been confronting a huge problem, and this problem is called post-COVID. Nevertheless, we decided to open the Grand Palais, and we just opened the Grand Palais with an exhibition called Pompeii. And that exhibition is very, very timely because, as you know, the life in Pompeii got completely disrupted, brought to a standstill about 2000 years ago in 79 after Christ on October 24. And that's exactly what happened to our life in Paris. The life was brought to a standstill on March 16. We had to close all the exhibitions everywhere in the city, and we are now opening them bit by bit. And again, we had planned to make this exhibition on Pompeii, and that's our first exhibition which we have reopened the Grand Palais. I'm saying this because it's a very difficult time. It's a very difficult time because it's probably the time whereby all museums all over the world are reflecting on their present and on their future, on their near future and on their far future. And is this going to be the Pompeii of the life of museums? Well, maybe yes, well, maybe no. But we do know that we have to change the life of museums. What is very, very, very important is that we have been discussing the future of museums already in the 60s. We have been discussing it in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. But since March 16, worldwide, this discussion about the life of museums has never, ever been so prevalent, has never ever been so imminent, has never ever been so important. And it's very interesting that the future of museums, the discussion about the future of museums, started already before the COVID period. First, we had in some museums, especially in the United States, a discussion about governance. How do we want our museums to be run? And in many museums in the United States, the question was about ethics of funders, but also ethics of trustees. To give you one example, the Whitney Museum, they didn't want to have their museum run by a board of which one of the trustees was the owner of a surveillance company, of surveillance business. We had another discussion about funders who clearly invested in pharmaceutical industries. So that's one of the discussions which started before post-COVID. Another discussion which started before the post-COVID period was the discussion about the presence of female artists, as a result probably also of the Me Too movement. These two discussions about how do we want our museums to be governed and what about the presence of non-male or female artists presided the discussion about the museum in another area, which is the area of post-COVID, which then went together with a discussion which in the United States but also in Europe was dealing and is dealing with representation of the other, also called Lives Matter, and all the museums, they hurled to be participating in this discussion. And when I said they hurled into participating this discussion, this meant also in some cases that museums had to confront crises around their staffing, crises also around the museum, how it's run, but also what kind of collections do we have. So in a nutshell, within 3 years' time, and especially now in 3 months' time, we have a discussion about the change, the necessary change of museums. And when I go back to the headlines of articles in the newspaper and in magazines, then you can clearly say that these discussions started already in April. I'm reading one of the headlines is museums must adopt new models to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an article which appeared on April 24. Another article which appeared on April 24 on the same day said there is no fast track back to normal. Museums confront economic fallout of the pandemic. Also in April, also in April, there was an article appearing on April 21st already. In the changed world after lockdown, we will need smarter new ways to interact with art. I believe virtual reality is the answer. And that's an article by the artistic director of Acute Art in London, Daniel Birnbaum. In May, these discussions continued, and I'm reading the title of another article. Before the lockdown, the public was agitating for a revolution in the way museums operate. Will this crisis finally force true change? Another article said, immersive art experience used to be everywhere, but can they outlast the coronavirus pandemic? And a recent article was discussing the trouble with video art in the age of COVID-19. Curator Adam Simzik, he spoke out also about the future of museums only a few days ago, and he says museums must evolve or they will not exist, etc., etc., etc. You can actually publish a whole encyclopedia, an encyclopedia about all and with all these articles which we have been reading, which we have been discussing, which we have been seeing appearing since March 16. So something has to be done about the life of museums. And in March 2019, the Stedelijk Museum in Schiedam near Rotterdam opened an exhibition, Rothko and I. And Rothko and I was based on the principle one work, one spectator. In this case, Mark Rothko's Grey, Orange on Maroon, number 8, 1960, on loan from the nearby Museum Boijmans van Beuningen, where I used to work in the 90s. And the painting by Mark Rothko could only be seen in the Stedelijk Museum Schiedam by one visitor at a time in an isolated room with a bench for 5 minutes or longer if no other person is waiting. And the sense of isolation was reinforced by forbidding the use of mobile phones for photographing or any other activity while in the room, and by providing additional acoustic isolation through the use of noise-cancelling headphones, thereby acknowledging, even in absentia, the multi-sensory dimension of the work. And this highly successful project was ultimately presented during a full year, coincidentally ending on March 22nd, 2020, at a time when the museum and all other museums in Europe had closed its doors because of COVID, because of the confinement. And in some aspects, this work presented by the Stedelijk Museum in Schiedam, which is a small museum, predicted what museums will need to think about when reopening their doors and taking into account the new social situation created by COVID-19. When social distancing becomes the norm for some time ahead, museums do have to take practical decisions on how to host their visitors and organize their visit. And for this reason and others like international travel restrictions and environmental concerns, blockbuster traveling exhibitions will become rarer and permanent collections will come back to the foreground. Visitors will need to book in advance on given time slots, fewer visitors will be allowed, group visits will be excluded for some time, and isn't then the one work, one visitor the ultimate format that would both satisfy sanitary requirements and the need to keep museums open for economic and social benefits? This would of course be the limit case, being both unpractical and economically unsustainable, of course, on a larger scale. But what consequences should museums draw from the present crisis? First, as many museum directors have noticed, closed museums, museums without visitors, are not museums, they are just storage rooms. And while some time ago some museum directors and curators could still consider their audiences as hindrances to good conversation, for instance, now many say, like I did already a few years ago, that the public is not the problem, it is the solution, and the solution to the reopening of museums has to be found in the interaction between the art, the space and the visitors, all of which can be called bodies. Through the presence of the virus, we have rediscovered the power of the body, its fragility, but also its capacity to resist or immune itself. And we also realize that we live with other people's bodies, who can be potentially and most often unknowingly dangerous to us. Therefore, we do take care of other people's bodies, but not just as threats. Isolation and confinement have reminded us of our social nature and the need for others' presence, and not just through Zoom and Skype. Taking care in every sense of other bodies makes of us, as I remarked in an article in April 2020, performers of social space. We need to organize our bodies in function of others, and we have already learned to do so when keeping minimal social distances. Museums are the spaces full of bodies. And as artist Joseph Gritchley once remarked, a body is both a reality and a metaphor. Books are bodies, exhibitions are bodies, and buildings are bodies. I'm introducing this lecture by trying to concentrate for a long time on what's happening right now. But does that mean that in this area of Pompeii, the sudden addition of museums, that we have to throw away all the ideas of the past and of the recent past? What I try to say in the book Tate Modern, Building a Museum for the 21st Century, I was director during 6 years of Tate Modern and also responsible with others for the extension number 2. What I try to say together with my boss, Nicholas Sirota, in this book is that indeed, if we want to think about the museum, we have to radically rethink its future. What we didn't know at the time when Nick and I published this book was, of course, this whole situation which we have right now, which is the situation of post-COVID. Post-COVID, indeed, is a situation we are not dealing with when designing our museums. And the design of our museums is still based on a much older concept, a concept which is going back to almost 200 years ago, and we can see in the world of architecture of museums only a few experiments which dare to challenge the notion of a museum building. And I do think that Tate Modern number 1, the extension you see on the left, and Tate Modern number 2, the extension you see on the right, was one of these radical experiments in order to try to come up with a different museum design. And the reason why I think we succeeded was that Tate Modern already saw its museum design completely depending on the use of the public. Let me recall that Tate Modern did this highly successful project called the Weather Project in 2003 by Oliver Eliasson. And what happened was, when Oliver Eliasson installed this artificial sun, that the public started to use the building and the space of Tate Modern, the turbine hall, in a completely unscripted way. The first days, the first weeks, the public came by the hundreds, by the thousands. But they did so in a completely different way. That means they started to program the space themselves. They started to use the space for themselves. And they were doing all kinds of things, even initiating things, which are not prescribed by the artist and by the museum rules or by the museum organization. They started to have sleepovers. They started to organize picnics. They started to use the space to produce communal gatherings. They were singing, they were sleeping, and worst of all, for museums, which is absolutely a taboo, some of these people started to show their own art. After a few days, a few weeks, the museum organization, which was quite in disarray, they decided that this was not a problem at all, but the solution of the problem of the public space. Indeed, suddenly the public was not a hindrance anymore. The public was the solution of the problem. How can these bodies of people interact with the body of a work of art, within the body of a museum, and within the body of a museum organization? Indeed, when you look at this picture of 2003, this is almost a picture like we start to see in our museums right now. Some groups are people who know each other, so they are allowed to be close, they are far, they are in a social distance from other tiny groups of people. So this is indeed proof that when you give over your museum to the body of the spectator, that you can find things which are completely unexpected. Tate was also known for having other artists invading the turbine hall, and also other audiences started to use the space of Tate Modern for something completely different. In the case of the artist Doris Salcedo, a Colombian artist who cut through the space of the turbine hall a very deep cut, demonstrators started to use the space of the turbine hall and the work of Doris Salcedo to demonstrate, to campaign for living wage campaign, for the living wage, for the minimum wage. Was this prescribed by the museum? No. Was this prescribed by the artist? Probably not. But indeed, the bodies of these spectators started to make the work of art, to have the work of art come alive. The reason I stress this is that, interestingly enough, when we checked with Tate Modern the main motivations for visiting, that spiritual, looking for inspiration, was absolutely important, but only for 11% of the Tate Modern audience. Emotional, aesthetic experience was important for about 14% of the audience of Tate Modern. Intellectual, to gain knowledge, was important for 29%. But 45% of the interrogated audience members of Tate Modern, and this was an interrogation or an investigation done in, I believe, 2014, 2015, 45% of the visitors said that the reason why they wanted to come to visit Tate Modern was basically social, to spend time with others. Of course, today in the post-COVID situation, as I have been giving a couple of examples of, to spend time with others is restricted to very, very precisely defined rules, which we call social distancing, which also call to put up mask, which is also called for making sure that we reduce the number of visitors being present at one space at a time. And as I've been saying in the beginning, this of course is going to cause economical problems, it's going to cause organizational problems, but it's also going to cause probably totally different ideas which we have to come up in terms of displaying works of art. I mean, the exhibition at Tate Modern of Steve McQueen was stopped because the exhibition of Steve McQueen was not confirm these new rules in terms of social distancing, because Steve McQueen is a video artist, film artist, who requires very specific space installations. And one had to shut the exhibition of Steve McQueen at Tate Modern exactly because these installation requirements by the artist cannot make up responding to these new rules. And the article which I quoted, The Trouble with Video Art in the Age of COVID-19, is saying Steve McQueen's acclaimed survey at Tate Modern is the latest exhibition to fall victim to social distancing rules. So when most of the audiences say Tate Modern, we want to visit Tate Modern because of social reasons, to spend time with the others, that means also we have to reinvent the spaces of museums and even reinvent exhibition displays in order to allow people to spend time with others. What's interesting is that when we think about the reason why people flock to museums, it is also because museums is a mass medium, which in difference to other disciplines, in difference to the discipline of the opera, the discipline of cinema, the discipline of art, the museum and visual art today is a discipline which is basically responding to so many different needs. The reason I show you this older art forum cover is that museum and visual arts, they are dealing with basically every single other discipline of culture. This cover is showing Mondrian, yes. It's showing Matthew Barney, yes. It's showing a photo by Gilbert and George, yes. But it's also showing images of rock and roll. It shows images of fashion. It shows images of architecture. It shows an image underneath of a very popular TV series, absolutely fabulous, on TV. It's also dealing with photography. Museums are dealing with so many other disciplines because visual arts is almost like a sponge absorbing other disciplines. Art plus architecture, art plus design, art plus fashion, art plus photography, art plus music, art plus TV, art plus design, art plus rock and roll. So when we think about the museum today, it's not only a very social space in order to spend time with others, but it's also a space for the sign of plus, art plus other disciplines. So it is very important that in this post-COVID age that we know that the expectations of museums are very high. Yes, we have to provide for spaces in order to spend time with others, and yes, we have to provide for programs which are dealing with so many different disciplines. And maybe that leads to the question, isn't the museum going to implode? That we expect too much from the museum? Does that mean today, in the urgency of post-COVID, that we have also to make sure that our programs are not only coming more into balance, but that we maybe have to restrict our programs to lesser excursions into other disciplines, does that mean that we, for instance, have to concentrate more on the collections? These questions are not resolved yet, because many of these questions are also raised by the concerns of curators, by the concerns of artists. It is indeed true that the visual arts is a sponge which is absorbing so many other disciplines, that the discipline of visual arts is not having a cultural space of itself anymore. What's interesting is that when we look at cover of Art News magazine in 2001, that the museums were incredibly growing. Incredibly growing, and we thought that we could solve the problem of the museum by making our museums bigger. But already 10 years later, in 2013, one started to change from mortar and brick. The problem of the museum can be solved by making museums bigger. Suddenly we started to say we can solve the problem of the museum when we adhere much more to the bodies of the spectator and not just the body of the museum. Indeed, when we look at what happened in Tate Modern, we didn't have only the weather project with all these people participating in the turbine hall, liking to do their own projects or liking to expose their own bodies. We suddenly also saw in the turbine hall other projects like the one of Doris Salcedo, whereby we saw mass demonstrations or demonstrations by groups of people demonstrating for living wage. We also saw at Tate Modern and other museums, we also saw that dance was invited again back into the museum, just like in the 60s and like in the 70s, not only in the Museum of Modern Art, not only in Tate Modern, not only in the Centre Pompidou, but dance was suddenly reintroduced after highly being successful in museums in the 60s and the 70s into the turbine hall of Tate Modern. Indeed, these bodies were claiming their space in the space of the museum. And I think that's the most important message of this picture by Boris Sharmats, where he's asking the question if Tate Modern was a museum of dance, that the museum space was claimed by bodies of the spectator. But also, the museum is claimed by the bodies of demonstrators, and we have seen that, of course, in recent weeks by Black Lives Matter, but it already started a few years ago. Museums are claimed by individual spectators because they do not feel represented, and this was a demonstration in front of Tate Modern already a few years ago. The fact that the museum is claimed by so many bodies is shown by this image, which is probably now an image of long gone times. I took the image in last summer in Versailles, which has indeed millions of visitors a year, and due to social distancing, Versailles, of course, has to reduce the numbers of visitors. That the bodies of spectators are becoming more and more important is also being illustrated and shown by this image of the new MoMA. Indeed, museums are invaded by furniture, whereas a few years ago we had only empty spaces with artworks hanging on the wall in a chronological style or in different styles or transhistorical. Now suddenly we see that our museum spaces are invaded by furniture because people want to use our museums in a different way. They want to use our museums just like we saw in the weather project of Oliver Eliasson, or in the project by Doris Salcedo, the cut through the turbine hall, or in the project of Boris Sharmats, if Tate was a museum of dance. Spectators, visitors want to organize themselves in the museum, and they do want and need furniture. It will be very important to think indeed of our museums in the future as a space for social bodies. And we have to do that also because we want our public museums to be different of the private museum of the present, but also the private museum of the future. The private museum, in any case, is something which is not based on durability, but can only be based on a short-term period. And the reason I say can only be based, that's not me who wants that, but it's a fact that so many private museums, they only have an existence of 5 to 10 to 15 years. In the best cases, the owners of private museums, they made a ruling for themselves that they say we will only exist 25 years or only exist 50 years, and then our holdings, our building is coming back to the public. There are other private museums who are saying we are not a private museum. Even if we are a private museum, we are a public museum by excellence, which I don't believe is true, because a private museum has other rulings than the public museum. It would lead me to go too far into this issue. I've been publishing about it a lot in an article I wrote called Indiana Jones and the Ruin of the Private Museum. I predicted that we would have an explosion of private museums, but that private museums were going to become a problem for themselves, because the owners of private museums suddenly they recognize that it costs so much in order to operate on a very, very, very long term. And I warn everybody that private museums are going to cost us, the public body, a lot of money, because what are we going to do when these private museums with their rich holdings, with their, I have to admit, fantastic buildings, are falling apart because they are short of money, because there are problems with the owners, because they want to do something else. And now, of course, we are confronted with the fact that many of these rich owners of private museums are confronted with an economical recession. So will we have so many ruins like in mainland China, where we have empty private museums, empty buildings, which are beautiful buildings to admit, but there is no program, there is no collection, there is no staff, and there are no audiences. So what are we going to do with all these buildings? So I want everybody who wants to run a private museum to think about the fact that a private museum is costing a lot of money if you want to run your private museum longer than 5 to 10 years. The difference with a public museum, with a public collection, is that we are running a public museum not for the present. We want to run it for the future. We want to build something for the future, for several generations. And that becomes more and more important today when we think about what's happening in the past months. That is, if our public museums are going to exist much longer than the crisis period, we have to come up a way to reinvent a new way of dealing with our audiences and a new way of dealing with our collections and a new way of dealing with our exhibitions. We cannot continue to make these spectacular blockbuster exhibitions. We cannot. We simply cannot, for economical reasons. We cannot for ecological reasons. And we can also not because today public museums, they're hesitating, at least in the next years to come, to say, yes, you can have our Rembrandt, yes, you can have our Magritte, go on, we will organize for you the transport, you may have to pay a fee or not, but you can get this loan from us. That's not going to happen anymore, because so many museums have first to resolve their own issues done to all these crises which are happening since, not only since 3 months, but now since 3 years. The crisis of governance, the crisis of ethical funding, the crisis of who is represented in the collection, the crisis, of course, of COVID, and the crisis of the fact that museums are monuments for a society which was apparently unchangeable, but is now going to have to change, because there are so many other people who do not feel represented, who are knocking on the doors of the museum and say, we want to feel represented as well. Does that mean that we have to leave the canon like we used to know it? That means to present the so-called best of the best? Do we have to allow other works of art in which do not belong to the canon? Do we have even to allow works of art in which we consider not of the highest quality, but which for other reasons, sociological reasons, are equally interesting? All these things are today up for grasp, and we have to take all these questions incredibly serious. When I show you this building by Frank Gehry in Arles, this building of Frank Gehry is by itself a beautiful building, but the question is, will the public body, once the private owner decides to leave Arles, for whatever reason, in 10 years, 20 years or 30 years time, will the city of Arles be able to find a purpose for this building? Probably yes, but also the question is, will the city of Arles have enough money to run such a building? And the question is also, what can this building do in 10 or 20 or 30 years, different from what is it going to do right now? So the question of the Museum of the Future is not just a question of design of the museum. It's not just a question of what is the collection about. It is basically a question about the organization of museums, and I think that private museums and their possible crisis in 5 or 10 years and possible crisis in the way that we are going to confront an economical crisis, that the private museums are a very good example about the fact that we cannot solve everything by architecture. We will have to solve many things by the organization of our museums. How are we going to organize ourselves? Which is not just a question about who is going to be the director, who is going to be the chief curator, who is going to be the curator, who is going to be the trustee. We have to question the whole idea of the organization of the museum. I would say that in the future, when we discuss the future of museums and when we discuss building and extending museums, that we have to think about first about all other options, and that the last option will be, okay, we're going to rebuild the museum, we're going to extend the museum, we're going to build a new museum. All other options have to be studied first. Do we want a smaller organization? Do we want a bigger organization? Which kind of communities are we going to deal with? It's interesting enough that even Tate Modern came up, as many other museums, even the Louvre, saying we now recognize that we first have to work, first and for all, for a local community. There was no saying about first and foremost for local communities in the Louvre until a few months ago. Tate Modern also was thriving on international visitors. However, the directors of Tate Modern and of Tate, they are now saying we have first and foremost a responsibility to local communities. You see, this new awareness is going to lead, of course, to a new architecture for museums. And don't forget that when we talk about private museums, that many private museums, because of the fact that they are not durable, already are changing overnight into something else, like the Generali Foundation in Vienna, which has now become a shopping mall, whereby the Generali Foundation was one of the most radical museums, private museums, run in Europe. And even that museum, run so radically, with such a radical program, with such a radical collection, with such radical ideas, was not capable to resist against or to resist the time. Does that mean then that exhibitions like Meet the Vincent van Gogh, which are exhibitions which are dealing with the digital, does that mean that these museums are now the future? I don't believe so. These digital exhibitions, these digital museums, they might be important for this moment in time, but we have to consider them as labs for the future. A lot of these digital exhibitions, like sadly enough the Meet Vincent van Gogh, are exhibitions which are like a plasma. They are a plasma because they not even are capable to bring us into the oeuvre of an artist, into the mind of an artist. They are just illustrations, they are theatrical setups, and I still do think that it's important to start to explore these kind of possibilities, but what we have seen so far is not at all satisfactory. Yes, we are able to touch a copy of Van Gogh, but what does that learn us about Van Gogh? It doesn't learn us very much. We have to ask other questions. However, I'm not throwing the child away with the bathwater. Not at all. I do think that digital, I do think that augmented reality, I do think that virtual reality is incredibly important, but we are not there yet. We have to consider it as tests. And our Pompeii exhibition, which we opened very recently, which was planned to open in March, but we couldn't go on because of post-COVID, is another test to look into how can we solve the future of big exhibitions, how can we solve the future of all these tourist sites which are overcrowded. Yes, we can think about new technologies, but we are not finding, I think, yet the answer. We have to test these exhibitions. The reason I'm showing you this slide is because probably we have to come up with new types of exhibitions, with new types of spaces. And Dorothea van Hentelmann, the German critic, is asking in her manifesto, which she published at the time of the beginning of the Shed in New York, that space in New York, which is conceived by Diller and Scovidio. She was asking the following question: if the theater was the space for democracy in the ancient times, if the church was the space for art in the medieval times, if the museum was the space for art at the beginning of the industrial times, 18th, 19th century, today we have to ask, what is a new ritual space for the 21st century, where the public and where ideas about the arts are radically changing? Can we come up with a new type of space? And of course, sorry, we are trying to come up with new types of spaces like the Shed in New York. We are trying to come up with new types of spaces like the Fondazione Prada, but we are not there yet. I think we have to look at new spaces like gardens of cooperation. And I'm showing you the German writer, philosopher, but also artist and filmmaker Alexander Kluge, who created a very successful exhibition a few years ago at the Venice Biennial, which was called The Boat is Leaking, at the Fondazione Prada. And this exhibition actually was considered by most participants and most visitors to the Biennial of Venice as the most important exhibition, because this exhibition was a theater, it was a cinema studio, it was an exhibition, it was an historical moment, it was functioning like an archive, it was indeed something which did not exist yet. And everybody was flocking into it. Everybody was flocking into it because one found oneself with a new type of exhibition which is trying to reinvent itself. and which trying to become something else we don't know yet. So indeed we are starting to see the beginning of something new. The beginning of something new, like virtual exhibitions, immersive exhibitions. We are not there yet. Exhibitions like the one of Alexander Kluge at Fondazione Prada, which is dealing with theater, cinema, and exhibition. So begin to detect something new, and we shouldn't give up, because we gave up way too early to something which we were very keen about in the 20s and the 30s and even in the 50s, which was thinking about radical, new, experimental exhibition displays. And these radical new experimental displays, they always took and take into account and have to take into account the bodies of the spectators. Here it's typical that we think that this is an image of a post-COVID situation with social distancing. No, not at all. It was part of the exhibition display created by Anna Fibrock, a very famous German theater art director, for the exhibition by Alexander Kluge for Fondazione Prada. So we are the beginning at a new epoch where we have to take exhibition display again very, very serious. We have to experiment with exhibition display, and we can learn from other disciplines in that sense. That's what I tried to do with my first exhibition in the beginning of the 80s. In the beginning of the 80s, I created an exhibition called Theater Garden Bestiarium, and it was basically based on ideas which I found in a German magazine, Kunstforum, in a special issue called Golden October, which was dealing, strangely enough, in 1983 with architecture, sculpture, painting, decoration, photography, film, music, theater, and dance. And it was dealing with so many different artists, so different from Dan Graham to Thomas Schutte to Jean-Luc Godard, but also to Jeff Wall, Thomas Struth, Thomas Roof, and many, 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 many others. And even dancers as William Forsythe were included in this magazine. This magazine predicted, and we still have to wait for it, that we cannot divide anymore up the art world in spaces for theater, in spaces for interior decoration, spaces for dance, spaces for architecture, but that we have to try to come up with spaces which are dealing with these very, very different disciplines. And I based my first exhibition on the outcome of this magazine, and this is an article called Everything is Between Two. It was the press conference of Jean-Luc Godard in Cannes, where he spoke about his film Passion, which was a film shot in a studio which looked like a museum, which looked like a painter's studio. So in that time I produced works by Dan Graham, like Interior Space for Space Showing Video, and I decided to ask, together with my fellow curator Rudiger Schuttle, artists like Jeff Wall, artists like Juan Munoz, artists like Alain Sejas, artists like Dan Graham, artists like James Coleman and Rodney Graham, to come up with an exhibition in the form of a theater. In the form of a theater where we had tribunes for the spectators and where the artists were assigned spaces and locations in that given space. We constructed, with the help of architects, we constructed a theater space, and here you see that the spectators are sitting on these tribunes watching the exhibition, an exhibition which is almost looking like a film or like a theater piece. We see works by, in the middle of Jeff Wall, we see works by Juan Munoz, we see works by the other artist. This is the Juan Munoz piece, this is the Jeff Wall piece, this is the interior of a Dan Graham piece, and the space is divided like a cinema, because the artworks were lit and were projected on with different types of images, and the musical score was done by Glenn Branca. So I would say it's incredibly interesting to live in the age of today. The age of today, which is an age of limitations and restrictions due to what's happening in this COVID period, in this post-COVID period, that we have to come up with radical new ideas, not just for the building of museums, but also for its organizations, for its programs, for its collections, for the way we deal with staffing, for the way we deal with audiences. And these ideas and these urgencies are now more than ever welcome, because when we think again about the articles, the titles I read at the beginning of this presentation, then it's very clear that these ideas are not just welcomed by our politicians, they are not just welcomed by the artist, by the collector, by the audiences, they are welcomed by everybody. So it's time to be very courageous, and to make sure that we do not hide from exploring totally new ideas. And some spaces are starting to ask these questions already. We shouldn't look at these questions like questions which are questions of a crisis. No, we should look at these as burning, positive, constructive questions. We are ready for it. And when I see that today our youngsters, they are especially interested in everything which is digital, like a research of the French Ministry of Culture was concluding, does that mean that we have to say goodbye to this older media, the media of exhibitions, the media of the opera, the media of the theater? No, not at all. We have to make sure that our younger generations, who are clearly interested first and foremost in digital, that they are welcomed in these museums which are fit for them, which are changing for them, in order to say, well, this is also your world, this must be your world, and you will want to have a say in it. So that's what I wanted to say by this lecture today. Let's conceive, just like Dan Graham in this theater, film theater, he conceived, let's just reconceive our museums, let's reconceive our exhibitions. And it's time to do that, and many people are wishing for these things to happen, and we are ready to take this on. Thank you very much.
In your lecture earlier, you talked about ethical funding, especially for private museums, and you mentioned one example where this museum refused to receive funding from an owner of a security company, like security monitoring company. Could you explain further how this kind of funding will have a negative impact on the operation of the museums?
First of all, I used the word tear gas. The term tear gas is coming from the United States, and it illustrates the case of a trustee member of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, where artists who were part of the Whitney Biennial started a protest which got followed by the staff, saying, if we present works which are criticizing policing, which are criticizing surveillance, then how come that we have on the board of trustees an entrepreneur who is making lots of money and donations to museums like the Whitney only on the back of the weapon industry. So it's a case, a well-known case in New York at the Whitney Museum. And the tear gas trustee can be found in many boards of trustees in the United States, but also in other countries, like think about Great Britain. I'm not saying that all these trustees are producing weapons, tear gas, and policing, but the word became a kind of symbol for if we want funders for our museums, let's make sure that these are ethical funders. And I'm also illustrating that case, or I'm using that case to illustrate the fact that we have so many emergencies in the governance of museums, which is, for instance, the role of a woman, both in terms of managerial posts, but also female artists who are part of the collection or the exhibition program. And of course, you know that after this so-called crisis or questioning, then we got the crisis of the ethical funding. The case of tear gas at the Whitney Museum is one example, but there are many other examples. Think about what happened at the Serpentine Gallery, where the director had to withdraw because she and her family were involved producing surveillance tools. And after that crisis, a couple of months later, we have the Black Lives Matter crisis, which of course did not just start a few weeks ago because of the death of George Floyd, but which was something which has been present, the frustration over underrepresentation of other artists, other audiences, other engagement programs. And now that crisis is really felt because quite many colleagues had to step down, also partially in due to cancel culture, which is also affecting the public arts in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. My own space, which I found in Rotterdam in the 90s, called Witte de Wit, named after a famous admiral, famous because he was the leader of one of these companies, trade companies in the Netherlands of the 17th century. That very name, Witte de Wit, has to be changed and will be changed. And I think it will be changed into a name which I'm particularly fond of. And that name is invented by the artist Ken Lum, who I showed in the 90s at Witte de Wit. And the name now of Witte de Wit will be changed in Melly Shoem, after a work by Ken Lum called Melly Shoem Hates Her Job. So that's another example. and there are many crises in terms of governance which are now following, and such a crisis is also a technical crisis. Think about what happened to the Steve McQueen show at Tate Modern, where the way we display video art has to be adapted to the new social distance rules, because we cannot deal with black boxes and the entrance for audiences in these black boxes like we used to. So the fact that we will have less visitors in our exhibitions due to the pandemic, the COVID, will also have an effect on the way we display exhibitions. So all of this is happening since a few months, and that means that we have a congestion of crises. Can you imagine when we started to speak about changing the museum in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that these changes are now happening overnight. And another crisis is the physical infrastructure of museums. We know that the extension and building boom of museums is diminishing compared to the years before 2020. But paradoxically enough, we need now bigger museums because we need to create more space, not for the works of art, the collections, the programs, exhibition programs, performative programs, education programs, but we need more space because we have to invent post-COVID architecture. So the building boom is maybe over, but we have to radically reinvent physical infrastructure of museums because of this new post-COVID architecture, whereby our bodies are now becoming bodies which are as important as the bodies of works of art, the bodies of exhibitions, the bodies of activities, because they're all bodies.
刚才呢，我要先讲到说关于这个道德资金的部分的话，我先谈一个例子，是美国最早会有出现这样的一个问题，是因为呢，曾经在惠特尼美术馆他们的这一个董事会里面有一位董事呢，是他的公司是在做催泪瓦斯的。那在惠特尼双年展里面呢，就有出现一些艺术作品是在抗议这个民众被监督的这样的一些作品，所以大家就开始去质疑说，如果我们在支持这样的艺术作品，可是同时间呢，董事会里面的董事，他的公司生财的来源就是在制造催泪瓦斯，然后他捐钱给惠特尼美术馆，可是他所代表的是一个武器的工业，那这是不是值得思索的一个问题？所以从这个纽约的案例来看的话，其实在美国这种情况还蛮常见的，就是很多美术馆里面的这些大型的捐赠人，很可能都是跟一些道德会有一些道德资金上面的一些相关的问题，然后这也不是只有美国，其实你看其他国家也会有这样的情形，英国也是一样。那我并不是说好像所有的这一些董事一定都有这个相关的问题，但是从这个例子让我们开始来思考说美术馆的这一些它的资金，然后是不是符合道德的原则。那我觉得这个例子也可以让我们去来思索另外一个重要的问题，就是在美术馆要面临的治理的问题。而且现在美术馆在谈的这个治理 governance 是一个非常迫切的议题，然后这里面有许多的多元性，比如说我们也可以谈到像是女性的艺术家她的代表性不足的问题。好，那我们刚刚提到的这一个道德资金还有其他的例子，像是在英国的 Serpentine 蛇形画廊，他们曾经差一点会有一位 董事或者是主席，他们整个家族哦，就是在做这种安全监控设备的。那后来呢，他的这个任命的就被否决了，他没有当到这一个馆长或者是主席这样的位置。但是在那件事情之后，刚好不久之后就发生了这个黑人的命也是命这一个抗议活动。那这个抗议活动呢，当然它是最早的起源是因为 George Floyd 的这个死亡，但其实我觉得不只是这样，它是长期以来累积的，就是大家认为说某一些族群的代表性不足，然后长期让人民感到愤怒和沮丧。那我们说的这个代表性不足的话，在美术馆里面就是包含说像是艺术家当中那种他者 others 的不足，还有观众的参与的不足，那这个是早就已经存在的问题。那我们不管是在美国、英国、法国或者是比利时、荷兰等等这些国家，都会看到有这个资本文化所造成的这些影响。那像我自己在鹿特丹这边的话呢，就是曾经90年代的时候，我们有一个美术馆要改名。那最主要原因是因为它原本的这个名字是来自于19世纪的一个荷兰的贸易公司。那这个贸易公司会跟殖民时代有一些关系，所以后来决定要改名字。那这些都是跟我们提到这个道德自清有关的一些例子但我想更强调的是说，其实现在美术馆面临的是一个治理的危机。那比如说我在演讲里面提到的 Steve McQueen 的这个展览它这个展览的话，实际上我们去思考的是说，在现在这样的一个疫情时代，然后需要去遵守社交距离，然后要用什么样的方式来呈现这个展览？它已经不能用它原始艺术家所设计的那种黑盒子的形式，然后用过去惯常的观众入场进场的那样的一个入口来做。好，那当然现在因为疫情，所以我们进到美术馆的这一个观众的数量是减少，但它不只是冲击这个观众的数量，它还冲击到我们呈现展览品的方式。可是要谈到这个危机的话，我认为它也不是只有现在才开始，因为美术馆的这一个改变，很早以前就很多人在讨论，比如50年代或是80年代的时候，大家也都在谈，只是现在它终于发生，而且发生的剧烈又快速。那另外要谈到另外一个危机的话，就是讲到这个基础建设，因为在相较之下，就是2020年之前，我们可以看到有许多美术馆的建筑是大兴土木这样的案例。那现在变得很吊诡的是说，我们现在2020年以后，虽然这样的这个基础建设大兴土木的例子变少很多，可是反而我们现在是更需要更大的美术馆。那我们需要更大的美术馆的原因，不只是在于说，好像艺术品需要有更多的这个摆放的位置，其实更重要还是在于我们在疫情发生以后，到后疫情时代，大家要去思考的是整个基础设施要做什么样的改变。好，然后包含说，在这个后疫情时代的话，我们需要什么样新形态的建筑？那人的身体，就是我们观众的身体，进到美术馆里面来，它的重要性可能不亚于艺术品的重要性，所以我们要去思考这个新形态的建筑和新形态的基础设施。
That in the lecture which you just saw, which was pre-recorded a few weeks ago, that I selected, consciously or unconsciously, so many photos and examples of spaces full of bodies. Normally, when you talk about museums, you speak about dead objects which are not moving. But in my lecture, I selected, consciously or unconsciously, so many images with people. And indeed, museums are bodies, exhibitions are bodies, collections are bodies, audiences are bodies. And I think this foreboding of the presence of bodies is also a way to say that we have to take into account that our museums are full of bodies. I'm not talking about masses of visitors. I'm talking about the presence of the audience. And that's going to change radically the way we deal with exhibitions, displays, content, choreography of exhibition, hanging of collections, designing museum. So I see the COVID and all these crises which are happening overnight as something which can have a, I'm not saying happy end, but can create change. But we have to be very conscious about it. We have to deal with it in a very lucid way.
我另外想补充说明的就是，大家可以看到刚才这段影片哦，其实是几周以前我就已经预先录制的，但是不晓得是有意识或无意识，在影片里面我放了很多的照片，然后举的例子，你都会看到那个空间里面是有很多的身体的，就是我一直在讲的 body 这个字啊。那一般我们讲到美术馆的时候，谈到的都是一些静止的物件，它是不会动的。可是你们在我的演讲里面看到的很多照片都有人，那因为我在强调这个概念，就是说，其实美术馆它也是一个实体，它是 body， 然后展览也是，我们的典藏品也是，观众也是，他们都是 body。那这么多的这个实体和身体，都是我们美术馆在未来做，不管是要做任何改变，都必须要考量的因素。好，那我讲的不只是说在美术馆里面的这个观众变多，所以身体会变多，我不纯粹是这个意思。所以我是讲说呢，我们看到的美术馆的这种每一个实体，然后跟它有关的这些因素，在未来的话，它其实都会大规模的改变我们怎么样处理我们展示的方法。我们怎么样呈现一个展览，怎么样去像编舞家一样把它编出来，然后怎么样去设计一个美术馆，都会受到这一些身体的影响。那我们现在所看到的这一个新冠肺炎的疫情，它这些危机好像是一夕之间发生的。那我并不是在讲说它会很快的就让我们看到一个快乐的结局，可是我确实认为这样的一个危机呢，反而是促成我们去创造更多的改变。Well, the second question is about the restriction for private museum development, and you mentioned in particular that organization, how they are organized, will have an impact on their future. Could you also share with us your suggestion for the organization of a public museum in the future?
I mean, the private museums are having a very particular kind of governance, which has nothing to do with the governance of public museums. Because first of all, the rule of a public museum is that the museum is not just there for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. The collection is not just there for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But we are pretending that we are there for several generations, which completely is then another way of governing a museum. Because a private museum is most of the time short-term, is a business plan which is very much similar to other businesses. And a public museum, of course, is not in the first place an economical model or a short-term model, but is a long-term model and has an economical guarantee because it's the guarantee of the state who has the duty to deliver, amongst others, culture to the public and for the public. Now, in terms of the future of public museums, if we have a crisis such as COVID or ethical funding or underrepresentation of the other, we cannot solve this by building new museums, by extensions, by radically changing exhibitions. No, we have first to start with the social organization of the museum. What is the role of the director of a museum? What is the role of the chief director? What is the role of the curators? What is the role of the educational department? And can we still continue to collect like before? Don't we have too many works of art? And our exhibitions, they put long enough on? Because today with the COVID, transportation, insurance, all of that is changing. And these changes will have a deep effect on how we as staff of a museum, of how we are managed, or how we work together. And what is then our social contract, both with the government and with the audience? So the solution for the future of museums is not like it used to be in terms of building activity, but it's, I think, a question of social organization. And that makes it for me very exciting, because it's like soft power of museums is in the hands of the staff. That means that the director and the trustees, they have even more responsibility today and tomorrow than they used to have.
谈到私人美术馆的时候，其实它有一种特定的治理方式，会跟公立的美术馆很不一样，因为公立的美术馆，它不会说好像限定我就是只有在2年或者10年这样营运之后就不会营运了。它公立的美术馆，它要去思考的是要经历非常多的世代，为后世子孙来永续的经营。那所以它的这个治理方式是很不一样的。私人的美术馆的话，通常它的这个时间会比较短一点，然后比较会像是要有一个营运计划，真的就是像企业界的营运计划那样子。那公立的美术馆的话呢，它在思考的重点倒不是像这样的一个经济的来源，用经济的模式来看，然后他思考的也不是短期的，他要看的是长期的。那在经济方面的话，因为他有政府的出资，所以其实他要想的是他的责任，他背负的责任就是要为大众来提供这些相关的文化内容。那未来的这个公立的美术馆的话，我认为说，除了我们所讲到的这一些危机，像是新冠肺炎的疫情，或者是道德资金，还有这个他者的代表性不足等等这些问题都是公立美术馆要持续面对的一些危机。那这些危机并不是用新设立美术馆或是扩建美术馆就可以解决的问题。更重要的是，我们要开始来思考这个美术馆它的社会结构、社会组织，也就是说，你要去思考美术馆里面的馆长、策展人，还有比如说教育推广部，他们到底是扮演什么样的角色？那我们这个美术馆是不是还能够持续的像过去一样，继续的典藏更多的艺术作品？还是我们会变得作品太多，没有办法做好的存放？那我们还可以用过去的方式继续的来办理展览吗？其实在这个疫情的影响之下，不管说是运费或者是保险都出现了一些改变，所以展览的方式，然后经费的规划可能也都跟过去是不同的。我觉得说，其实最重要的就是它会影响到我们美术馆的整个人员的配置，还有美术馆它管理的方式。然后它要去思考的呢，是美术馆跟政府还有跟观众之间所签的这样的一个社会契约，就是它的社会责任是在哪里。那所以这一个解决的方法并不是在于说去把美术馆的这个建筑来做的更大更好，而是要去思考说它的社会组织。那也就是美术馆要给他的馆员更大的这个力量、更大的权力，然后馆长或者是董事这边的话，他们也要承担比以往更大的责任。
And there will be many more questions, new questions, which our governmental bodies and our staffs and management teams of museums will have to deal with. I'm not just talking about ecology. I'm not just talking about social distancing, but I'm talking also about maybe we have to forget the old idea of competition. And maybe we have to look for new forms of cooperation. And maybe we have to forget the fact that we think in terms of separate disciplines. Probably we cannot make a difference anymore between educational systems, between systems which are specifically tooled for live arts, performative art. Maybe we have to look in these new forms of cooperation as well. Cooperation between theaters and museums, universities and museums, community groups and museums, and even look into museums as an instrument for producing art, the production of art.
那我们刚讲到的很多这个新的问题我认为其实是政府跟美术馆的这个馆员还有管理的团队都也需要一起来面对的。那我讲的不只是说像是一些政治的政策的问题，或者是说像社交距离这样的问题，而是说我们要抛弃过去这种彼此竞争的模式，要采取一个新的合作的模式，然后也会看到说各个领域之间的界限是越来越模糊的。比如说教育跟美术馆可以合作，然后剧场跟美术馆也可以合作。那我们看到大学和美术馆也可以合作，社区跟美术馆也可以合作。那美术馆呢，更应该把自己当作说是一个用来创造跟生产艺术的一个工具。
And that's the reason also why I showed in my lecture a few examples, both old and new, of completely new types of exhibitions, whereby the question is this a theater? Is it a film screening? Is it a garden? Is it a dark space? Is it a group show? Or is it in between all these things? And the show I did in the 80s, the Bestiarium show, with Dan Graham, Jeff Wall, Rodney Graham, and other artists, is an early example of trying to come up with new ways of making exhibitions.
所以我在演讲里面举很多的例子，都谈到了一些全新类型的展览。我想要提问的就是，这个是展览还是一个剧场？那它是一个美术馆还是一个放映会？好，那我可以做很多这样的有很多这样的例子，而且它其实都是在灰色地带的。那像80年代的时候，我所策划的这个展览《动物寓言》里面，它就已经提出了很多新的方法来看待美术馆的存在。